Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of August. Today we're looking at important developments from the Pokrovsk direction, then going northwards to Klishchiivka and Chasiv Yar. We're going to zoom in and look specifically at engagements near Zelane, which is now a village of particular interest that the Russians are attacking from several axes. We're going to zoom in and look at the gains from the past 24 hours that are verified by Ukrainian sources, whether they be Petrenko or Deep State. You could see here that it is a rather small piece of territory in terms of the maximum gain. The Russians advanced not even 100 meters eastwards. What is important, though, is that the Russian forces have been able to retain control over the rail station here, which means they have solidified the wedge in between Zelane and Serhivka. And so no longer can the Ukrainians bank on the hope that they can utilize the rail bank over here as a sort of connector between these two villages that could sort of serve more broadly as a temporary defense line spanning from Serhivka and then going eastwards all the way to Mezhove. That cannot happen because the Russians used the rail embankment to cut a wedge in between those two villages and basically eliminate any sort of coordination and then take out both villages one by one. They are rather small settlements, especially Serhivka, where a lot of the reinforcements have just recently arrived either from the rear or while retreating from the front line. So in either case, it is just very disorganized, understandably. And now the Russians, they're putting most of their focus on Zelane. You could see actually that they were able to reach the first residential areas from the west. There's also pressure coming in from this northern direction. And there are reports that are still unverified of an additional Russian advance from the northeastern position around this trench, leading to the northeastern outskirts, basically around this agricultural facility. But for now, we don't have any sort of corroborating evidence of a Russian advance here. But definitely keep an eye out because a lot of the information that is circulating online is preliminary, and a lot of it does end up getting verified 24 or 48 hours later because the fighting here has become so fluid and is changing so much that a lot of the footage could just not keep up with it. But now we're beginning to see some of the footage from earlier this week when the Russians made their initial advances past villages such as Pokrovsk and Wedge. So here's just one of them. This is from August 3rd. It was released. This is from the 15th Brigade. Further confirmation of my claims that this unit is one of the main ones that is operating west of the river here. And so they conducted FPV strikes on a Ukrainian Bradley infantry fighting vehicle north of Zelane. So it conducted a troop rotation. That's when it was spotted by the first FPV and struck. And then once again, while it was driving along this particular tree line in this horizontal direction, probably to either engage with Russian targets over here to the east or here to the west, that's when it was struck by a second FPV and it eventually was destroyed as a result. And so this gives us the idea that the 47th Brigade is still here because they are infamous for utilizing these infantry fighting vehicles and that they are continuing to send their fighters right to the line of contact to get involved in fighting for every single tree line, basically. And that's still their role, essentially, even after months of being delegated with the most difficult tasks, with the ones that are the most intensive in terms of resources and manpower. They still do need to continue with that because they have the equipment needed and they do still have the manpower needed, given the fact that they were able to incorporate a battalion of prisoners. I don't know if it was actually battalion size in the ballpark of 500 to 1,000, but they did get a new sort of independent battalion filled with prisoners called the Shkval Battalion. And I'm sure that a lot of the fighting here, maybe not from Bradley operators, but specifically from infantry, is actually being done by those prisoners. They were the ones that defended in Novoslivka Pershov for a large chunk of the actual engagements there. And so now, just zooming out for a second, you could see that Serhivka, the situation over here, is still pretty interesting because the Russians are about, let's measure it, 300 meters away from the village, and there are unconfirmed reports from the Russian side that they've been able to advance even closer within a distance of about 600 meters. And so it's really unknown which garrison is defending here. But the 47th Brigade is the one that we have the most information about because their strike drone company, which is a really strong drone unit of the Ukrainians, released a compilation showing various Russians that they were able to take out using FPV drones. And that's become one of the main causes of death for soldiers at the front line, these FPV drones, which makes a lot of sense because, as has been reported on by Ukrainian media, the volume of Russian troops and their squads that are advancing through tree lines has increased. That is because the Russians feel more emboldened, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One is artillery cover, one is the fact they have elevation advantage. They feel concealment is helping them out in some of these windbreaks here. And they also are more eager to just sort of exploit their previous advances and aren't feeling as much pushback from the Ukrainians on the ground. Where they are feeling it more so is from the skies. And that's where the FPVs come in, and they've played a big role in increasing Russian casualties. That could have been actually pretty low if FPVs weren't a factor, but they definitely are. And you can see that with just dozens of examples in the compilations from the 47th Brigade. And it's not too surprising when you think about it, because even though the foliage here does provide a certain level of concealment, just in terms of just looking into the FPV, it sometimes is hard to see those Russian soldiers. But there are also other reconnaissance drones, Mavics that are also flying around all the time, trying to get an idea of where Russian squads are pushing through. And a lot of time, it's not being done alone anymore. It's being done in larger groups. The Russians have felt more comfortable ever since they captured Chasiv, sending in larger squads, starting with 4, 5, 6, and then actually getting higher than that in some cases, reaching a dozen when they enter into Pokrovsk. And so then it makes it easier to spot that grouping as they advance. And once again, to reiterate, it does appear that the Ukrainians are trying to dig in their heels in Jelane. The issue is they've reached this point where they're deciding on locking in here too late, because the Russians have already made inroads from several directions and do already have really important elevation advantage from the east and the west. And so any sort of Ukrainian resistance here will be limited in its sort of amount of time. And then the next issue that you have to look at is what's going to stop the Russians from them pushing south towards these other villages here, like Novojelane. The issue with the fall of this village and other ones as well is that it's going to open an avenue for the Russians to continue being able to utilize their heights to advance southwards, you could say, in the immediate future, 2 kilometers, 2.5 kilometers, and then just completely taking out all these defenses here that were built west of the Vavcha River. And then also looking even further westwards, it does have an issue because the Russians would be able to take over local roads that lead directly to Mykolaiivka and also Novohordivka. Novohordivka is an important logistics hub in the same sort of vein that Hordivka is to the north. And being able to advance around here would give the Russians control over the hills that overlook Hordivka from the west, or from the east, you could say, and then from the south overlook the actual village of Hordivka. And so then that is a big issue. And more broadly, I could see how the battlefield is being shaped in a way that will allow the Russians to get closer and take over favorable positions that overlook Selidove. And that is a more long-term issue, in the same way that we talk about, for instance, Mirnohrad. But you can't keep really looking, you can't sort of look past that fact, because it is really what we're seeing with all the arrows pointing in that certain direction in terms of Russian intentions. Now, looking northwards at the Chasiv Yar front, we're beginning with Klishchiivka. We all know that the Russians conducted during the spring, that's when it really did intensify. There were also attempts during the winter of last year and this year to try to take over heights 215. A lot of back and forth here. Eventually, the Ukrainians were able to just maintain their positions here around the perimeter. And it was interesting. The Russians actually tried pushing through this height that you see marked in this yellow, there are yellow trenches here, but it is a blue area. They try to do it through these forested regions, which makes sense because of the concealment, but they're all located on valleys that are overlooked by the Ukrainian positions on that hill. And so it really became a kill zone for the Russian forces in this sort of small strip of land spanning maybe 800 meters, where the Russians continue sending in troops and also motorcyclists, trying to eventually overrun the trenches. But they were just simply too well built, and the defenders there, it was just too conducive for them. So there was no means by which to dislodge them. Eventually, the attack sort of died down. And then, of course, we had the capture of Klishchiivka, which sort of unfolded around, I believe, June of of this year. And you can see some of the geolocations from July, where the Russian forces really just started to attempt at least to solidify control of nearby outskirts. Again, the big issue with directly going through Klishchiivka is that, of course, it's good to capture a organized settlement for the basements and all that, but then the Ukrainians still control the really important dominant heights to the west that are still just so perfectly overlooking Klishchiivka, and the Russians can't even utilize the forested regions nearby to their maximum extent because it's currently in a gray zone. And so the Ukrainians or the Russians now, they don't just have the ability to advance from the northeast, they could also advance directly from Klishchiivka. And so that's what we've seen them attempt to do, even if it is on a lower elevated surface. And so the Russians were able to advance, if we're measuring it, about, let's see, based on the distances, they were able to push about 400 meters westwards based on a geolocated video from August 2nd. And it shows two Russian soldiers that were storming the trenches here. And you could see that it really is elaborate. A lot of them are difficult to see just from an overhead view, but they are definitely there. A lot of them have sort of seeped underground and do have a camouflage component. Some of them have a concrete component as well, making it less susceptible to artillery strikes or drone strikes. And a lot of them are just sort of zigzag in nature, which makes sense, trying to reduce the blast from an artillery shell. And there definitely have been a lot of artillery craters created here. But just zooming in, they were able to take a Ukrainian soldier prisoner. And of course, it occurred around here. So there are nearby trenches, as you can see, even on Google Maps. And so as the Ukrainian was taken prisoner, there were also other Ukrainians in nearby dugouts that were engaging with the Russians. But nobody gets hurt in the video. It's just the one POW. And that's confirmation of a Russian presence. In terms of the reports from the Russians, they're saying that there are Akhmat special forces operating here. I don't know which unit that is exactly because there's probably like 5 or 6 separate units for the entire sort of Akhmat detachment. And I don't know which one of them is a special force unit. There's a National Guard unit. There's a 78th Regiment. But I'll try to find that and map it out over here. And they were working in conjunction with the LPR's 4th Motorized Brigade, really experienced units. They've been at this sort of general Bakhmut Chasiv Yar area for like a year and a half, and they also have a strong artillery component. And so it makes sense that they're now being reintroduced to the battle after not really hearing from them much. And so they are also involved with the actual storming of the trench. Now the storming here would give the Russians equal footing, but it's more than that because it's also a fortified area. So there are positions to set up like sniper fire or machine gun fire because you have all of these different sort of now, you can't really call them bunkers in earnest, but there are a lot of concrete structures here that could be utilized, taken advantage of by the Russians. And from there, they could fire upon the open fields. Even if they're on hills, it is still on pretty similar elevation, and it could become difficult for the Ukrainians to just hold on to that without any sort of nearby defensive node to act as a coordination point. Because if we're looking, there really isn't any other village for the Ukrainians in this region besides Bila Hora to the southwest and Stopochki. And I think that the Russians are now going to make an attempt. It could take a while, so I'm not going to give a timeline, but I do think the Russians are interested in just completely expelling the Ukrainians from this X over here. This is completely getting rid of a Ukrainian presence east of the canal here. And the reason why is because even Wagner in 2023, they had this really important bridgehead across the canal, which reached really close to Stopochki. It also sort of extended throughout the entirety of the forest, both east and west of the canal. And that was threatening Chasiv Yar's southern flank. And capturing all of these various slag heaps and quarries and hills, that would give the Russians the necessary sort of impetus on the southern flank that could actually put pressure and eventually squeeze out the Ukrainians from the center of Chasiv Yar. And doing that directly is also possible, but using that southern flank would speed up the process and reduce casualties. So I would look into that possibility. Also because by the flanking through the canal, the Russians would be able to cut off the highway here, the T0504 highway, which leads directly to another important city called Chasiv, which we have to look at how the Ukrainians try to build up the rear over there in the next few months. Speaking of Chasiv Yar itself, we now have this core grouping of Ukrainian units that are definitely around here and are defending from house to house in these residential areas. And again, you can see a lot of them on the map here. Kraken, 225th Battalion, 23rd Brigade, 24th Brigade. The list really does go on. It's not an extraordinary amount of forces because a lot of them are only battalions or elements of certain units like a drone company. And that's also concerning, and I've spoken about this in detail in other parts of the front line. But having all these battalions split up and not being able to communicate with one another, work together because they're split up across hundreds of kilometers, that's really bad. The brigade headquarters is not able to work effectively under those sort of conditions. I don't know how it even exists. And so then you have battalions that are just totally detached. And how are they working with totally separate brigades? that is hard to explain, and then it's even worse for drone units. But in the videos that we're seeing, there actually is coordination between drone elements and full mechanized brigades like the Ochi Eyes drone units, which is really active now in this front. And they're working with the 23rd Brigade, and they released an interesting video. I think it was actually yesterday, August 2nd, and it shows how they were able to drop TM62 landmines. And those ones, they explode on impact, I believe. And so they cause a really massive explosion, larger than your regular grenade from an FPV drone, dropped specifically on houses and also on the nearby trenches. And then also the MOA 900, which I hadn't heard of before, but apparently it's some sort of thermobaric explosive, and it does cause a really large blast field. And so that's what the Ukrainians are now using, trying to increase the explosiveness of their bombs onto the Russian houses here. And you could see that based on this game, based on the geolocation from the Ukrainian compilation, the Russians advanced 300 meters, took over additional portions of this trench line over here, and have now actually been confirmed to be within the houses of Chasiv Yar, something that we previously were speculating about. I didn't make the announcement official because I didn't have proof. Now we actually do. And it is a big deal for the Russians that they've been able to rather quickly advance along this northern vector and sort of eliminate the usefulness of the trench line that is running west of the canal, because that could have been a really fortified line that could have held up the Russians if the Russians did not take advantage of the physical crossing through the forest here, utilizing DRGs initially, because it is located on a height and it's dug in. And then you could have even a small amount of Ukrainian forces just consistently looking past the canal and spotting any sort of Russian soldiers that pop out of the forest and try to cross over. And so that was a big concern, and the Russians knew about it, and that's why they just sort of went from the north and are now flanking it from this northern attack vector. So that is a big issue for the rest of the trenches here that are nearby, and for all the houses that are located in the Zhvotnevi district, which is the name of this northeastern part of Chasiv Yar, and then also the Novi district. You have to look out for it in the southern portion of Chasiv Yar. So yeah, that's really all for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next upload. Goodbye.